"Put the gun down," the man in booth 9 said quietly. Not a warning, not a threat. Just 4 words spoken the way you'd remind someone they left their keys on the table. "You don't want this." Ryan Miller's hands were already shaking, and the man hadn't even stood up yet. If you've never seen a moment where the whole world holds its breath, where one wrong move decides everything, then stay right here. Because what happened inside Pioneer Wells Diner on a Thursday night in the Mojave Desert wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was something the security camera captured that nobody expected to see. And once you watch it, you can't look away. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Mojave Desert doesn't care about your problems. It doesn't care that you owe money to the wrong people. It doesn't care that your cousin talked you into something you knew in your gut was a terrible idea. It doesn't care that you haven't slept in 3 days because every time you close your eyes, you see a man named Toad Velasquez standing at the foot of your bed, smiling with teeth that look like they were designed specifically to make you feel small. The desert just sits there, flat, silent, indifferent, stretching out in every direction like God forgot to finish it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, nothing right off Route 58 between Barstow and Kramer Junction, there's a diner called Pioneer Wells. It's been there since 1962. The sign out front still has the original lettering, though 2 of the bulbs burned out sometime during the Clinton administration, and nobody ever replaced them. The parking lot is cracked asphalt held together mostly by memory and old motor oil stains. There's a string of orange lights along the roof line that blink on some nights and stay dark on others, as if the diner itself can't decide whether it wants to be seen. Inside, it smells like coffee that's been warming since morning and pie crust that's been in the oven since before most of the customers were born. The stools at the counter have red vinyl seats, and 3 of them wobble in a way that regular customers have memorized, and tourists always discover the hard way. The booths along the wall are dark wood and cracked leather, and the table in booth 9, the one at the very back near the hallway to the restrooms, has a carved initial in the corner, a K, inside a rough circle that nobody remembers making and nobody has ever tried to sand away. On a normal Thursday night, Pioneer Wells is exactly what it looks like. A tired roadside diner trying its best at the edge of the world. Truckers stop in, travelers stop in, sometimes families on their way to or from Las Vegas stop in because the kids need to use the bathroom and someone spots the pie case through the window. This was not a normal Thursday night. Ryan Miller turned 26 years old 4 months before that night, and he celebrated his birthday alone in the apartment he shared with his cousin Jake because they couldn't afford to go anywhere, and there was nobody left to invite. His girlfriend had taken their daughter Lily and moved back to her mother's house in Victorville after Ryan lost his job at the warehouse. That was 8 months ago. The warehouse job had paid $14 an hour, and it wasn't much, but it was enough to keep things held together with Scotch tape and optimism. Without it, everything came apart faster than Ryan had believed possible. The debt started small, a few $100s borrowed from a guy Jake knew just to cover 2 months of rent and keep the lights on while Ryan looked for work. The guy Jake knew had a friend, and the friend had a system, and the system had a name, and the name was Toad Velasquez. Nobody called him that to his face, at least nobody who'd done it twice. Toad ran a lending operation out of a used tire shop on the south side of Barstow. The operation had no paperwork, no interest rate that any bank would recognize as legal, and no patience for people who were late. What it had instead was a very clear understanding between borrower and lender. You pay what you owe when you owe it in full, or the conversation changes in ways you don't want it to change. Ryan had borrowed $1,100. By the time that Thursday night came around, he owed $4,200. He didn't fully understand how that had happened. He understood it mathematically. He'd missed payments. The interest had compounded in ways that seemed designed by someone with a very specific sense of humor about human suffering, but he didn't understand it in his bones the way he needed to understand it to accept it. It still felt like a mistake, like someone had added a column wrong, and eventually they'd figure that out, and everything would reset back to something manageable. Jake had explained to him gently at first, and then with increasing directness, that this was not how Toad Velasquez operated. He sent someone to the apartment. Jake told him on a Tuesday, 3 days before the Thursday, that would change everything. They were sitting in the kitchen, which had a broken ceiling fan that made a sound like a slow metronome when the wind came through the window screen. Guy didn't say anything, just stood at the door and looked at me for like 30 seconds. Then he left. Ryan stared at the table. What does that mean? It means we're out of time, Ryan. It means we need to do something. I'm working on it. You're not working on anything. You've been sitting in this apartment for 3 weeks watching true crime documentaries and not answering your phone. Ryan didn't argue with that because it was accurate. So, what do you want to do, Jake? What exactly are you suggesting? Jake was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going quiet before he said something he knew was going to land badly, like he was giving the idea one last chance to turn into something better before he released it into the world. I've been watching that diner, Jake said finally. The one off 58, Pioneer Wells. Ryan looked at him. What do you mean watching it? I mean, I drove out there 3 times this week, different times a night. The late shift on Thursday is a woman named Brenda. I heard someone call her that. She's the only one working the floor after 9. The cook is an older guy, works the back. There's maybe 4 or 5 customers at most, and they're usually truckers who just want to eat and get back on the road. Jake folded his hands on the table. Thursday nights, they keep about 3,000 in the register before they close out. Sometimes more. The ceiling fan ticked. Ryan said nothing. It's 40 minutes from here, Jake continued. We go in, we're out in under 5 minutes. We pay towed, we're done. We're out. Jake, I know. I know what it is, Ryan, I know. But what's the alternative? You tell me what the alternative is, and I'll do that instead. Ryan didn't have an alternative. That was the problem. He turned the problem over in his mind for weeks, looking at it from every angle, the way you turn a Rubik's Cube, hoping a new configuration will suddenly make sense. And every time he arrived at the same conclusion, there was no clean exit. There was no job coming through in time. There was no money appearing from somewhere. There was no version of this that ended well through patience and good intentions. There was only what Jake was describing, or there was what happened when Toad sent someone to stand at your door and look at you in silence for 30 seconds. We don't hurt anyone, Ryan said. Of course not. We go in, we make our point, we take the register, and we leave. That's exactly what we do. And we never do anything like this again. Ever. This is the one time, Jake nodded. The one time. Ryan spent the next 2 days not sleeping and not eating much and thinking about Lily. She was 4 years old. She had his eyes, the gray-green ones that his mother always said came from her side of the family, and that Ryan had always privately considered his best feature. Lily called him Daddy Rye, which she'd invented herself at age 2.5, and which destroyed him every single time he heard it in a way he couldn't explain to anyone who didn't have a child. He hadn't seen her in 6 weeks. Her mother, Cassie, wasn't keeping her away deliberately. She wasn't that kind of person, but Victorville was far, and Ryan didn't have reliable transportation, and the situation between them was tender, in the specific way that situations get when love has curdled into worry and disappointment, but not quite into hatred. He thought about calling Cassie. He thought about it at 2 in the morning on Wednesday, sitting on the edge of his bed with his phone in his hands, staring at her name and his contacts. He thought about what he would say. He thought about how the conversation would go. He put the phone down without dialing. On Thursday morning, Jake laid out the plan one more time, step by step, the way you'd go over a flight checklist. Ryan listened and asked questions, and Jake answered them, and by the end of it, the whole thing sounded almost reasonable, which Ryan understood was a sign that something had gone seriously wrong with his judgment. They left the apartment at 9:45. The drive to Pioneer Wells took 43 minutes on a clear night with no traffic, which a Thursday night in the Mojave usually provided. Ryan drove. Jake sat in the passenger seat with the duffel bag between his feet. The bag held 2 things, a length of zip ties, and a shotgun that Jake had borrowed from a man Ryan had never met and didn't want to meet. Ryan had a handgun in his waistband, a 9mm that he'd owned for 2 years, and fired exactly 4 times at a range outside Barstow, just to know how it worked. Neither of them talked much during the drive. At some point, Jake turned on the radio, and a country station came through something slow and sad about a man who lost everything, and Jake turned it off again almost immediately. You okay? Jake asked. No, Ryan said. Yeah, Jake looked out the window. Me either. The parking lot of Pioneer Wells came into view at 10:27. Ryan pulled off the highway and let the truck roll slowly through the entrance headlights, sweeping across the cracked asphalt. He counted vehicles the way Jake had told him to. A semi was parked along the far edge, engine idling. Two pickup trucks closer to the door. A station wagon near the road with a busted taillight. And then along the side of the building, half in shadow, half in the ambient glow of those blinking orange roofline lights, 8 motorcycles, parked in a perfect, deliberate row. Ryan's foot came off the gas without him consciously telling it to. The truck drifted to a slow roll. "Jake," he said, "I see them. I see them, Ryan." Ryan pulled the truck to a stop near the edge of the lot, still far enough from the entrance that no one inside would notice unless they were specifically watching the lot, which he would later realize at least one person inside was already doing. "We should go," Ryan said. His voice came out strange thin, like the desert air had already gotten into it. "Jake, we need that money. Not like this, not tonight. We can come back, Toad's guy comes Friday morning," Jake said quietly. "You know that. There is no coming back. There is no different night." He picked up the duffel bag from between his feet and unzipped it with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has already made their decision and is simply following through on it. "This is the night. We do it fast, and we do it clean, and we go home." Ryan looked at the motorcycles for a long moment. 8 of them, chrome and steel and leather, sitting there in that perfect row like a statement. He should have read that statement. He should have read it the way you read a weather warning or a wet floor sign, as information that exists specifically so you don't have to learn the hard way. He should have turned the truck around and driven back to Barstow and called Toad Velasquez and offered him whatever he had left, which wasn't much, and worked out something else, anything else. Instead, he put the truck in park. "Fast and clean," he said, "and fast and clean," Jake agreed. They pulled down their masks, simple black balaclavas that Jake had bought at a surplus store, and got out of the truck. Ryan felt the night air hit him dry and cold, the way Mojave nights always are, no matter how brutal the day was. His heart was doing something in his chest that he didn't have a medical name for. Not just fast frantic, like it had received information that the rest of him hadn't processed yet. They crossed the parking lot. Through the diner window, Ryan could see the counter. Brenda Kowalski, the waitress, 40s practical ponytail, the look of someone who had handled worse nights than this and expected to handle more, was refilling a coffee mug for a trucker sitting at the counter who was reading something on his phone and not paying attention to anything outside his immediate radius. The cook was invisible somewhere in the back. A couple near the window were sharing a piece of puff and talking in the quiet, unhurried way of people who have nothing urgent in front of them. And in booth 9 at the very back, 4 men sat in the shadows. Ryan registered them as shapes first. Dark shapes. Large somehow, even seated, not just physically large, but large in the room the way certain presences take up more space than their bodies actually occupy. He couldn't make out details from the parking lot, just the general impression of 4 people who were completely still, completely quiet, and not in any way resembling the kind of customers a small roadside diner normally collected at 10:30 on a Thursday night. He should have stopped then. He didn't stop. Jake pushed open the diner door and the bell above it made its small, cheerful sound, and the 2 of them stepped inside. The first 2 seconds were ordinary, or almost ordinary. Brenda looked up from the coffee pot. The trucker at the counter looked up from his phone. The couple near the window looked up from their pie. Everyone did the automatic, involuntary thing that people do when a door opens in a small space. They looked, they registered, they were in the process of looking away again. Then Ryan raised the shotgun. "Everybody down. Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt. This is a robbery." His voice came out louder than he'd intended, cracking on the last word in a way that he'd spent 2 days practicing to avoid. Jake moved to his left, covering the angle to the counter handgun, up scanning the room with eyes that Ryan could see were wide even behind the mask. Brenda dropped the coffee pot. It hit the floor and shattered, and hot coffee spread across the tiles in a dark stain. She raised both hands slowly, her face, the face of someone doing immediate professional-grade calculation. She wasn't panicking, Ryan noticed. She was thinking, working through something. That should have been a signal, too. The trucker at the counter slid off his stool and put his hands flat on the counter, which wasn't exactly what Ryan had instructed, but was close enough. The couple near the window, the woman made a sound. A small, involuntary intake of breath dropped below the table. Someone in the back, the cook, probably knocked something over. A heavy sound, metal on tile. "Register," Jake barked at Brenda. Open the register and back away from it. Do it now. Brenda moved toward the register, slowly, carefully, with her hands still visible, like she'd been specifically trained for this moment. Maybe she had. 20-some years of working late shifts at a diner in the Mojave, Ryan thought distractedly, you probably run the scenario in your head more than once. And then Ryan looked toward booth 9. The 4 men there had not moved. That was the thing he noticed first. Everybody else in the diner had reacted some version of freeze or flee or comply. These 4 men had not moved a centimeter. They were still in exactly the positions they'd been in before the door opened, before the shouting started, before the shotgun went up. 2 on each side of the booth, plates in front of them, coffee cups, and 4 pairs of eyes, calm, steady, measuring eyes turned toward Ryan with the focused attention of people who have just become very, very interested in something. Ryan aimed the shotgun at the booth. His hands were shaking. He didn't want them to be shaking. He'd specifically thought about this during the 2 days of not sleeping, and he'd told himself that when the moment came, his body would cooperate. His body was not cooperating. You too, he heard himself say, directed at the booth. His voice was doing the cracking thing again. Hands up, all 4 of you right now. 3 of the 4 men put their hands on the table slowly without expression. The 4th one, the one in the corner of the booth, the one who had been sitting with the specific stillness of a man who was exactly where he chose to be and knew exactly what was happening around him at every moment, looked at Ryan without raising his hands. He had dark hair going to gray, cut close. He wore a leather vest. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been tested a number of times over the years and had consistently passed. He couldn't have been less than 55, but there was nothing old about the way he looked at Ryan. Son, he said, and his voice was lower than Ryan had expected. Quieter, the kind of voice that carries precisely because it doesn't strain, put the gun down. A brief pause. You don't want this. Ryan stared at him. The room had gone absolutely silent. No one was breathing loud enough to hear. Even the desert outside seemed to have gotten quieter, as if the empty miles had leaned in. I said, Ryan started. I heard what you said. The man in the corner of booth 9 tilted his head slightly. I'm asking you to reconsider. Jake appeared at Ryan's shoulder. Ryan, he whispered, then louder, directed at the booth. All of you hands where I can. And then Jake stopped talking, because Jake had just read the patches on the leather vests. His breath came in sharp, a sound like someone had punched him in the chest. Ryan heard it. He turned to look at Jake's face, at the expression that had appeared there, not fear exactly, not panic, but something underneath both of those things, something more fundamental. The specific look of a person who has just understood that the situation they are in is categorically different from the situation they believed they were in when they walked through the door. Jake had done his research on Pioneer Wells. He'd watched the diner for 3 nights. He'd counted cars and timed shifts and calculated how many people would be inside and when. He'd done everything right by the metrics of planning a robbery. He had not accounted for the 8 motorcycles. He had not accounted for booth 9. He had not accounted for the man in the corner who was still watching Ryan with that expression of patient, absolute calm, and who had still not raised his hands, and who seemed in no particular hurry to do anything except wait and see what Ryan was going to do next. Ryan, Jake said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Just his name. That was all. But the way he said it, the weight that was suddenly in those 2 syllables, the way they landed in the quiet air of that diner, like the first 2 dominoes of something that was going to take a long time to fall, told Ryan everything he needed to know. Ryan Miller looked at the man in the corner of booth 9. The man looked back. And somewhere above the counter, at an angle that covered most of the dining room, a small security camera continued to record everything. The name on the patch was 3 words. Ryan couldn't read it from where he was standing. His eyes weren't working right. Everything had gone slightly soft at the edges, the way it does when your brain is receiving too much information at once and starts prioritizing badly. But Jake could read it. Jake was close enough. And Jake's face had done something that Ryan had never seen it do in 26 years of knowing him. Not when their uncle died. Not when Jake's truck got repossessed. Not when Toad's man had stood at their apartment door in silence for 30 seconds. Jake had gone white, not pale. White, like the blood had simply decided it had somewhere more important to be. Ryan, Jake said again, and this time the word came out different, not a warning, not a whisper, but something cracked down the middle like a board that's been under too much weight for too long, and has finally given. Ryan kept the shotgun up. His arms were burning. He hadn't realized until this moment how heavy a shotgun gets when everything in your nervous system is screaming at you to put it down and run. Jake, what? We need to go. Jake's voice had dropped to something that was barely sound at all, more like the shape of words without the substance. Ryan, we need to go right now. We're not going anywhere, said the man in booth 9. Not loud, not threatening in any conventional sense, just a statement of fact delivered the way you'd confirm a flight time or a street address. Matter of fact. Settled. Already true before he said it. Ryan swung the shotgun back toward the booth. I told you not to. You told me to put my hands up, the man said. He still hadn't raised them. He was looking at Ryan the way a chess player looks at a board 3 moves before checkmate. Not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the specific patience of someone who can already see how it ends and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. I'm choosing not to. That's a distinction worth understanding. The trucker at the counter had not moved from his position with his hands flat on the formica. He was staring straight ahead at the space between the coffee maker and the pie case, with the focused blankness of a man who has made a very deliberate decision to not be part of whatever this is. Brenda was at the register, both hands visible, but she had stopped moving toward it. She was watching the booth, watching the man in the corner, specifically with an expression that Ryan couldn't entirely read, not quite recognition, not quite fear, something in between that had its own specific gravity. One of the other men in the booth, heavy-set mid-40s, a beard that had been growing since roughly the previous administration, shifted slightly in his seat. Just a shift, a small, almost imperceptible realignment of weight. But Ryan caught it and the shotgun swung back, and the man went still again, his eyes steady, his hands flat on the table. Easy, said the man in the corner. And it wasn't directed at Ryan, it was directed at the heavy-set man, a single word carrying the weight of an instruction that everyone in the booth understood completely. The heavy-set man went still. Ryan's brain was trying to catch up with the situation and failing. He'd planned for scared people. He'd planned for compliance, the kind of wide-eyed, trembling, do-whatever-you-say compliance that comes naturally to ordinary people when someone walks into a room with a gun. He had not planned for this, for men who looked at him like he was a weather event, unfortunate, temporarily disruptive, but ultimately not capable of fundamentally altering their sense of themselves or their position in the world. Jake, Ryan said without lowering the gun. Tell me what you saw. Jake didn't answer. Jake. Hell's Angels, Jake said, 2 words, quiet as a confession. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ryan had ever heard. Brenda made a small sound behind the counter. Not a gasp, something smaller, something that suggested she had already known and had been waiting for one of the 2 idiots with guns to figure it out. The trucker at the counter closed his eyes briefly. The couple who had gone under the table near the window had not reappeared, and Ryan strongly suspected they were not going to reappear for quite some time. The man in the corner of booth 9, the one Jake had just identified by proxy, the one who had been watching Ryan with that unnerving quality of absolute stillness, picked up his coffee cup with his right hand, drank from it, set it back down with the careful, deliberate motion of someone making a point without making a point. His left hand remained on the table, relaxed open. My name is Callahan. Why, he said, Michael Callahan. I'm going to tell you that once because I think it matters for you to know who you're talking to. He looked at Ryan, then at Jake, then back at Ryan. I think you already understand what that means, based on your friend's reaction. Ryan's arms were shaking. He couldn't stop them. The shotgun was describing a small, involuntary arc in the air in front of him. I don't care who you are, he said. And even as he said it, he understood it was the single least convincing sentence he had ever spoken in his life. Sure you do, Callahan said. Not unkind, just accurate. But that's not the most important thing right now. He leaned back slightly in the booth, the movement so controlled it looked choreographed. The most important thing right now is that you've made a mistake and you're in the process of deciding whether to make it worse. I'd like to help you not do that. We just need the money from the register, Jake said suddenly. His voice had changed. The crack was gone, replaced by something flat and almost robotic. The voice of a person who has run out of emotional bandwidth and is now operating on pure logic. That's all. We take the money, we walk out. Nobody. Velasquez, Callahan said. Jake stopped. Ryan stopped. The word hung in the air of the diner like smoke, like something that had its own physical presence, its own weight, its own temperature. "Excuse me," Ryan said. "Toad Velasquez," Callahan said. He was looking at the table now, not at Ryan, and he was turning his coffee cup slowly with one hand, a small rotating motion back and forth. "That's the name, isn't it? The reason you're here. The reason you drove 40-something miles in the middle of the night and walked into a roadside diner with guns." He looked up. "How much?" Ryan felt something shift in the room. Not physically. Something in the quality of the air and the temperature of the silence. Like a tectonic plate had moved somewhere far below them, deep in the earth, too far down to feel as anything more than a slight wrongness in the pressure underfoot. "How do you know that name?" Ryan asked. "Because I know everything that happens in this part of the desert," Callahan said simply. "That's not arrogance, that's just fact. This is our territory. Barstow-Kramer Junction, everything along 58, we know what moves through here. We know the operations. We know the names." A pause. "We know Toad." The heavy-set man across from Callahan made a sound that might have been a short, humorless laugh. One of the other men in the booth, younger, shaved head forearms, like structural elements, looked at the table. Whatever that sound meant, it landed with the three of them, the way an inside reference lands something with history behind it that Ryan and Jake were not equipped to translate. "How much does he have you for?" Callahan asked again. Ryan didn't answer. He was aware, in some distant, increasingly academic way, that he was still holding a shotgun pointed roughly in the direction of a table full of Hell's Angels in a roadside diner in the Mojave Desert, and that this was objectively one of the worst positions a human being could find himself in, and yet somehow the conversation had shifted into territory where the gun felt almost irrelevant, like a prop that everyone present had silently agreed to stop acknowledging. 4,000, Jake said. Ryan turned to look at him. "Jake, 4,200, Jake said. He wasn't looking at Ryan. He was looking at Callahan with the expression of a man who has just decided, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, to tell the truth. "We borrowed 1,100 in August. He said the interest was—" Jake stopped, pressed his lips together. "He said a lot of things about the interest." Callahan nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving information that confirms something they already believed. "And Friday morning," he said. Jake blinked. "What?" "Someone comes Friday morning." It wasn't a question. "To the apartment, to collect." Jake stared at him. Ryan stared at him. "How?" Ryan said, and then stopped. Because the sentence didn't have anywhere to go. That made sense. "I told you," Callahan said. "I know what moves through this desert." He picked up his coffee cup again. Drank. Set it down. "Velasquez has been running that operation out of the tire shop for 3 years. He's got about 40 families on the hook right now. Barstow, Victorville, Hesperia, some out toward Needles. Same pattern every time. Small loan, high-need interest that compounds faster than anyone realizes until it's already impossible." He set the cup down. "He's not creative. He's just consistent." 40 families, Ryan repeated. Something cold was moving through him that had nothing to do with the Mojave night air. "At minimum." Callahan looked at him steadily. "You think you're the only one who walked into a bad situation because they needed $1,100? You think there aren't 30 other people that's sitting in 30 other apartments right now staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what they're going to do before Friday morning?" Ryan lowered the shotgun. He didn't decide to. His arms simply stopped holding it up. It dropped to his side barrel toward the floor, and he stood there in the middle of Pioneer Wells Diner, holding a weapon that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different version of himself, one that had walked through the door 20 minutes ago, believing he had a plan. "Ryan," Jake said sharply. Ryan shook his head. He was trying to locate a thought that made sense and failing. What are you?" "Oh," he looked at Callahan. "Wait, why are you telling us this? Why aren't you?" He gestured vaguely. The gesture was meant to encompass everything the Hells Angels would logically be expected to do to two people who had just walked into a diner pointing guns at them, but he couldn't find the words. "Because you're not criminals," Callahan said. The directness of it hit Ryan like cold water. "I've known criminals. I've been around criminals my entire adult life. You two are frightened. There's a difference." He tilted his head. "Put it on the table." "What?" "The shotgun. Put it on the table closest to you. Jake, yours too." Jake looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Jake. Some communication happened between them that required no words, the kind of communication available only to people who have known each other since childhood, who have grown up reading the particular frequencies of each other's faces. Jake shook his head slightly. Ryan nodded. Jake shook his head again. Ryan turned and set the shotgun on the nearest table, the one beside the counter that the trucker at the bar stool had been using to support his hands. Jake exhaled through his nose, long, slow. Then he set his handgun down beside it. The room breathed. Brenda behind the counter lowered her hands. She didn't lower them all the way. They came down to about chest height and stayed there hovering, as if she wasn't quite ready to commit to the situation being over. The trucker on the stool finally turned his head and looked at the table where the guns now sat, then looked away again very deliberately, the look of a man filing something under, "It's not my business," and intending to keep it filed there. "Sit down," Callahan said. Ryan looked at him. "Excuse me. Both of you, sit down, there." He indicated a booth across the aisle, booth 8, directly across from where he and his men were seated. "Brenda," he said without raising his voice, "would you bring 2 coffees when you get a chance?" Brenda blinked. Then, with the slightly stunned efficiency of someone running on professional autopilot, she turned toward the coffee maker. Ryan and Jake crossed the diner and sat down in booth 8. Ryan's legs gave out more than cooperated with the sitting motion. He folded into the seat the way a building collapses all at once, the structural tension suddenly gone. Across from him, the 4 men in booth 9 regarded them with expressions that ranged from composed assessment to something approaching mild curiosity, as if Ryan and Jake were a math problem that had turned out to have an interesting solution. "You're Ryan," Callahan said, not a question. Ryan looked up. "How do you said your cousin's name 3 times while you were standing there with the gun. He hasn't said yours, but you're the one Velasquez's man has been watching. The one with the kid." The air went out of Ryan's lungs. "Lily," Callahan said. 4 years old. Mother's name is Cassie. Lives with her grandmother in Victorville." Ryan's hands were flat on the table. He could feel the grain of the wood through his palms, the old scratched surface of a booth that had absorbed 30 years of conversations, and he focused on that sensation because it was the only thing in the room that was simple enough to hold on to. "How do you know that?" he said. His voice didn't sound like his voice. "How do you know any of that?" "Because Velasquez's operation touches families," Callahan said. "And when it touches families in our territory, we pay attention." He leaned forward slightly, just enough to reduce the distance between them to something that felt like directness rather than intimidation. "He knows about your daughter, Ryan. That's not information he has by accident. That's information he collected deliberately because it's the kind of information that makes people cooperate." The fluorescent light above booth 8 hummed. Brenda set 2 coffee cups on the table, white ceramic chipped on one side, full to the rim, and retreated without a word. Ryan stared at the coffee. He was trying to process something that was too large for the container of his current emotional state. "He knows where Lily is." "He knows where Lily is," Callahan confirmed. Jake said nothing. He was sitting very still with his hands in his lap, staring at the table, and Ryan recognized that stillness. It was the stillness Jake retreated to when he was frightened enough that all the energy his body normally used for expression was being redirected to holding himself together. "So this wasn't going to end with us paying him," Ryan said slowly. "Even if we'd gotten the money tonight. Even if the register had 3,000 in it and we'd walked out of here and driven straight to Barstow." "He would have found another number," Callahan said. "Another week, another compounding, another reason it wasn't enough." He sat back. "That's the business model. The debt isn't a problem to be solved. The debt is the product." Somewhere in the back of the diner, the cook appeared in the pass-through window. Ryan caught the movement in his peripheral vision. An older man, heavy-set flour on his apron, watching the dining room with the expression of someone who had been listening from the kitchen and had just now decided it was safe to look. He caught Ryan's eye briefly, then disappeared back into the kitchen. The sound of something being set on a stove. Ordinary sounds. The diner reassembling itself around an extraordinary situation. "What do we do?" Jake said. His voice was flat and small. Not defeated, something past defeated something on the other side of that. The voice of a person who has stopped trying to find the angle and is just asking for information. Callahan looked at him. Then at Ryan. He reached into the front pocket of his vest and produced a phone basic not new. The phone of a man who uses it as a tool rather than a lifestyle, and set it on the table. You let me make a call, he said. Ryan looked at the phone, then at Callahan. To who? To the person who explains to Toad Velasquez that this particular debt has been resolved. Callahan's voice was even, factual, and that his operation in this area of the desert is going to be looked at very closely going forward, and that the 40 families he currently has on the hook are going to be made aware that they have options. The heavy-set man across from Callahan, the one who had shifted earlier, the one who had made the short sound that might have been a laugh, was now looking at the phone on the table with an expression that suggested he had seen this particular tool deployed before and had specific feelings about what happened after. You can do that, Ryan asked. You can just one phone call and the debt is gone. It's not magic, Callahan said. It's a conversation between people who understand what they're risking if they don't reach an agreement. He paused. Toad understands risk. He's been in business 3 years because he understands it well enough to stay inside certain lines. When someone explains to him that those lines are moving, he adjusts. Another pause. He'll adjust. Ryan looked at Jake. Jake looked at Ryan. That wordless communication again. The childhood frequency, the cousin language. And this time what passed between them was something like, this is real. This is actually happening. I don't fully understand it, but I think we should believe it. Why, Ryan said. He needed to ask it. He needed the answer to exist. Why would you do this? We walked in here with guns. We pointed them at you. Why would you? Because you put the gun down when I asked you to, Callahan said simply. That tells me something about what kind of person you are. He looked at Ryan for a moment with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite judgment. Something more complicated than either something that had lived alongside a lot of human feeling for a long time and had arrived at a particular relationship with it. And because Velasquez has been a problem in this territory long enough, you two just gave me a good reason to address it. Brenda appeared from behind the counter. She was carrying the coffee pot, and she moved through the diner, refilling cups, the trucker at the counter, who accepted the refill without comment, still looking straight ahead. And she arrived at booth 8 and looked at Ryan's untouched cup, and then at Ryan and said in the voice of a woman who has been working late shifts in the Mojave for a very long time and does not have the bandwidth for nonsense. You should drink that. You look like you need it. Ryan drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. It had been on the warmer since early evening, and it tasted like it. It was the best thing he had ever put in his mouth. Callahan picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory. Ryan noticed. He didn't scroll through contacts, didn't look anything up. Just keyed in the digits, the way you dial a number you've known for years, and held the phone to his ear. The line rang twice. Then someone answered. Ryan couldn't hear the other side of the conversation. He could hear Callahan's side, which was brief, measured, and entirely lacking in the kind of dramatic intensity that the situation seemed to call for. Callahan sounded like he was arranging a pickup. It's Callahan, he said. Tell Toad I need 5 minutes. A pause. Yes, tonight. Another pause. Because I said tonight, that's why. He looked at his watch. Tell him to call this number in 10 minutes. He hung up. Jake was staring at him. That's it. That's the first part, Callahan said. He set the phone on the table again and picked up his coffee cup. Now we wait 10 minutes. The diner settled. It didn't relax. There was too much residual electricity in the air for anything like relaxation, but it settled the way a room settles after a door slams, finding its new equilibrium. The trucker at the counter ordered a piece of peon. Brenda cut it for him without comment. The couple near the window hadn't come out from under the table yet, but Ryan could hear quiet murmuring from that direction that suggested they were at least talking to each other. 8 minutes and 40 seconds later, Ryan had been watching the clock on the wall above the counter, the one shaped like a sunburst that had probably been purchased sometime in the 1970s. The phone rang. Callahan looked at the screen, showed it to Ryan. The name displayed was a single word, Toad. Ryan felt his stomach drop 6 inches. Callahan answered on the second ring. Toad. His voice was the same as it had been for the last 20 minutes, controlled, unhurried, occupying exactly as much space as it needed, and no more. We need to talk about something, or rather, you need to listen to something. It won't take long. He paused, listening. I know what time it is. I also know what you have going on in Barstow right now. So let's not do this. Another pause, longer this time, and whatever was coming through the phone on Velasquez's end, Callahan received it without expression. That's fine. I'm at Pioneer Wells. You know it. He nodded at something in the response. Then you know where I am and what that means. So here's what's going to happen. He laid it out in 4 sentences. The debt, specifically the debt owed by Ryan Miller and Jake Harris, was resolved. Velasquez's operation along the 58 corridor was going to receive close attention going forward. The families currently under obligation were going to be contacted, and this conversation was the only conversation on this topic that was going to happen. Then Callahan listened for almost a full minute. Ryan watched his face. There was nothing to read there. The 4 sentences might as well have been a grocery list for all the anxiety they produced in the man delivering them. I know, Callahan said finally, but I'm not asking. He hung up. The sunburst clock on the wall above the counter ticked 7 times in the silence that followed. It's done, Callahan said. Ryan heard those 2 words and didn't move. Neither did Jake. Neither did anyone else in the diner, actually even Brenda, who had been moving with that professional autopilot efficiency, stopped mid-reach for a coffee cup and stood very still, as if her body needed an extra second to verify what her ears had just received. Done, Ryan repeated. The word felt wrong in his mouth, too simple, too clean, like a single stitch over a wound that needed surgery. Just like that. Just like that, Callahan said. That's not, Ryan stopped. Started again. People don't just, $4,000 doesn't just disappear because someone makes a phone call. It does when the person making the call is explaining what the alternative looks like, Callahan said. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at Ryan with an expression of complete patience. Toad Velasquez is a businessman. What he does to people like you, the loans, the interest, the compounding, that's business. When someone shows him that continuing that particular line of business carries a specific cost, he recalculates. A pause. He recalculated. Jake was looking at his hands. He'd turned them over on the table, palms up, and he was staring at them the way you stare at something after you've almost dropped it. The residual awareness of how close the disaster was, the phantom weight of what nearly fell. I can't. He shook his head. I don't understand why you did this. Callahan looked at him, not unkindly. Yes, you do. Jake looked up. Because it was right, Callahan said. That's the whole reason. You're sitting here trying to find the angle, trying to find what we get out of it, what the catch is. There's no catch. You were in a trap that wasn't your fault. You made a bad decision trying to get out of it, and the bad decision happened to land you in front of someone who could do something about the actual problem. He picked up his coffee cup. Sometimes that's how it works. Not usually, but sometimes. The sunburst clock on the wall ticked. Brenda resumed her motion toward the coffee cups, the mechanical quality of it, suggesting she was doing it partly to have something to do with her hands. Ryan should have felt relief. He was waiting for relief. He had a specific expectation of what relief felt like. A loosening, a warmth, something unclenching in the chest, and it wasn't arriving on schedule. Instead, there was something else there, something sitting in the space where relief was supposed to be something heavier and less comfortable. 40 families, he said. Callahan looked at him. You said 40 families. In Barstow, Victorville, Hesperia. Ryan was staring at the table. The grain of the wood, the old scratches, the history of 1,000 people who'd sat in this booth and had conversations he'd never know about. They're still on the hook. Tonight they are. Ryan looked up. What does that mean? It means we're not finished talking about Toad Velasquez. Just because your debt is resolved doesn't mean his operation continues unchanged. Callahan set his cup down. What I told him on that phone that his operation would receive close attention going forward, that wasn't a threat. That was a schedule. Jake's head came up. You're going to shut him down. We're going to make it very uncomfortable for him to continue the way he's been continuing, Callahan said. There's a difference. We're not the law. We can't arrest him. We can't erase a system that's been running for 3 years with one phone call. A slight pause. But we can make sure that the people he has on the hook know they have options. We can make sure that the enforcement he relies on understands that coming into this territory to collect from families has become a significantly less attractive career choice. The heavy-set man across from Callahan, the one who'd been sitting with that particular stillness that Ryan had come to understand meant he was the kind of person who became very focused when something required focusing on, made a sound that was somewhere between agreement and anticipation. It wasn't aggressive. It was the sound of a man who has been waiting for a project to get started. Danny's going to enjoy that, said the younger man with the shaved head without looking up from his coffee. Danny enjoys too many things, Callahan said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, a thread of dry warmth that suggested a long history between these men, an ease that could only be built over years of shared roads and shared situations that made the whole exchange feel for a strange, dislocated moment, almost normal. Almost like four men in a booth at a diner having an ordinary conversation about ordinary things. Then Ryan looked at the table beside the counter where the two guns still sat, and the moment passed. I need to ask you something, Ryan said. Callahan waited. How did you know about Lillian, about Cassie, about Victorville? Ryan kept his voice even. It cost him something to keep it even. Velasquez's man, the one who came to our apartment, did he know where she was? Did he actually go there? Did anyone? No one went to Victorville, Callahan said. His voice changed slightly when he said it, not softer exactly, but more direct, the way a voice changes when someone understands that the answer they're delivering carries weight and wants to carry it carefully. Velasquez collects information. He doesn't deploy it until he needs to. Your daughter was insurance, Ryan. Something to mention if the collection conversation got complicated. He looked at Ryan steadily. She's safe. She was always safe. He needed you scared, not arrested. Ryan put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a moment, just a moment, 10 or 15 seconds, but the kind of 10 or 15 seconds that contain about 3 years of accumulated pressure. And then he came back up, his eyes wet at the corners, his jaw set in a way that was working very hard at being composed. Okay, he said. Okay. Jake reached across the table and put his hand briefly on Ryan's shoulder. Then he took it away. The gesture lasted maybe 2 seconds and said everything that needed saying. Brenda arrived at the booth. She set down a plate, 2 slices of pie apple, the kind with lattice crust and a dusting of cinnamon sugar on top without comment. Ryan looked up at her. She was already walking away. He looked at the pie. He looked at Callahan. She does that, the heavy-set man, Danny said. 3rd time we've been here. Every time something heavy gets said, she brings pie. It's like a law of physics. Is it good pie? Jake asked. His voice had something new in it, fragile, the thinnest possible thread of something that was working toward normal. It's exceptional pie, Danny said. Jake picked up a fork. It was, Ryan thought, one of the strangest things he had ever witnessed his cousin eating pie in a diner booth 45 minutes after they had walked into that same diner, planning to rob it while 4 Hells Angels sat 6 feet away, having a quiet conversation about operational scheduling, while Brenda topped off coffee like the last hour had been a perfectly ordinary part of her shift, while the trucker at the counter was now on his 2nd piece of pie himself and studiously minding his own business, while the couple near the window had finally cautiously reappeared from under the table and were sitting very close together and very quiet looking at their plates. The ordinary world was reassembling itself around something extraordinary. And the extraordinary thing was it was working. Ryan picked up the other fork. He ate. He wasn't tasting it, not really. His body was running on fumes and adrenaline residue, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from carrying a decision the wrong way for too long. But the fork moved, and the pie went down, and the warmth of it, the simple, uncomplicated physical warmth, did something that all the processing in his brain couldn't quite accomplish. It made the room real again. Can I ask you something else? Ryan said. He was still looking at the plate. Go ahead, Callahan said. What happens to us? He looked up. I mean, we walked in here with guns. We threatened people. We threatened you. He glanced at Danny, at the shaved head man, at the 4th man in the booth, who hadn't said a word the entire time, a lean, quiet man in his late 40s who had done nothing but watch the room with an attention so comprehensive it bordered on meditative. What happens after tonight? Callahan considered the question. He gave it the respect of actually considering it rather than having the answer ready. You walk out of here, he said finally. Same way you walked in. Nobody calls the police. Nobody files a report. He glanced at Brenda, who was behind the counter and had clearly heard every word. She gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a woman who has already made her decision and is confirming it. The security camera above the counter runs on a 24-hour loop and overwrites itself automatically. By this time tomorrow, there's no record of tonight that anyone could subpoena. Ryan stared at him. You're letting us go. I'm not letting you do anything. You're free. You were always free. Callahan's voice was matter of fact. You made a choice tonight, Ryan. When I asked you to put the gun down, you put it down. That's not nothing. A lot of people in your position wouldn't have done that. He looked at Jake. Either of you. Jake put his fork down. Why does that matter so much to you? Because it tells me who you are when the choice is hardest, Callahan said. Anyone can make good choices when it costs them nothing. You were scared, you were desperate, you had nothing left, and when someone told you there was a better way, you chose it. He picked up his coffee. That matters. The fourth man in the booth, the lean, quiet one who'd said nothing, finally spoke. He had a voice that matched everything else about him. Sparse measured the voice of someone who uses words the way a carpenter uses materials, cutting only what's needed and wasting nothing. You've got a daughter, he said, looking at Ryan. Go see her. Ryan felt the sentence in his sternum. It wasn't a dramatic statement. It wasn't delivered like one. But it landed somewhere below language, in the place where the things that actually matter about a life are stored, and it stayed there. He's right, Callahan said. Whatever comes next, whatever job you find, whatever you work out with Cassie, whatever you build back, it starts with going to Victorville and being in the same room as your kid. He paused. That's not advice. That's the only thing I know for certain about what a person should do when they're given a second chance. Brenda reappeared at the edge of the booth. She looked at Ryan and Jake the way someone looks when they've made a decision about a person that they didn't expect to make and aren't entirely comfortable with how much they mean it. You two want more coffee? Ryan looked up at her. After everything that's a yes or no question, hon. Yes, Ryan said. Please. She poured. She poured for Jake too without being asked, and then she moved to booth 9 and refilled 4 cups there. And as she moved away, she said under her breath to no one in particular, or possibly to the room in general, I've seen some things in 22 years working this counter. I've never seen anything like tonight. She didn't look at anyone when she said it. She said it the way people say true things when they're not performing them for anyone, when the truth is just heavy enough that it needs to be put somewhere outside yourself. Danny said, You're going to tell this story for the rest of your life, Brenda. I am absolutely never telling this story to anyone, she said, already moving back behind the counter. I'm going to go home and drink 1 glass of wine and not think about it. That's not how it works, Danny said. Thank you for the life advice. I'll take it under consideration. Ryan found himself exhaling something that was almost a laugh. Not quite. The mechanism for laughing was there, but the fuel wasn't fully loaded yet. But the shape of it, the almost laugh, the breath that wanted to be something lighter than everything he'd been carrying for the last 40 minutes, that was new. That was something that hadn't been there when he walked through the door. Jake was looking at the guns on the table near the counter. What do we do with those? He asked. Callahan looked at them, then at Danny. Some exchange passed between them that Ryan couldn't read, not words, just the specific kind of glance that serves as shorthand between people who've been in complicated situations together, often enough to have developed an efficient vocabulary for it. Danny will handle it, Callahan said. Jake nodded. He didn't ask what handle it meant. Ryan suspected he was in the same place Ryan was, past the point of needing to know every detail, willing to trust the direction of the current rather than fighting it. Then Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with the automatic motion of reflex, the phone-checking habit that exists below conscious thought, and looked at the screen. A text message. Cassie's name at the top. He stared at it. Hey, I know it's late. Lily asked about you before bed tonight. She wanted me to tell you she made you a drawing at preschool. A horse, she says. It looks like a purple cloud, but she's very committed to it being a horse. Thought you'd want to know. Ryan read it twice, then a third time. He put the phone face down on the table. He put both hands flat on the wood next to it. He looked at the grain of the booth top and breathed. Everything okay? Jake said quietly. Ryan picked the phone back up and looked at Cassie's message again. Then he typed, Tell her I love the horse. Tell her I'm going to come see it soon. Tell her Daddy Rice says hi. He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket. Yeah, he said. Yeah, everything's... He stopped. He looked across at Callahan, who was watching him with that expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite anything else, but was something true and human and real. It's going to be okay, Ryan said. And it wasn't performance. It wasn't the desperate optimism of someone trying to convince themselves. It was something he could feel for the first time in months as an actual possibility rather than a wish. I think it's actually going to be okay. It is, Callahan said. Simple, certain. The way he said everything. Outside beyond the windows of Pioneer Wells Diner, the Mojave night was exactly what it always was. Flat, dark, indifferent, enormous. The desert stretched out in all directions, silent and unchanged, as if the last hour had been a private conversation it was not interested in overhearing. The stars were out. They're always out in the Mojave in a way that city people find startling. Too many and too bright. The sky doing something it forgot how to do in places with traffic lights and street lamps. Somewhere on Route 58, a truck went past its lights, sweeping briefly across the parking lot before the sound of it faded into the nothing. Inside, the four men in booth 9 continued their meal. Not performing normalcy, actually normal in the specific way of people for whom unusual situations are not exceptional enough to interrupt dinner. Danny was talking about something, his voice low and even the cadence of someone telling a story, and the lean, quiet man was listening with the patient attention he brought to everything. And the third man, the one who'd been largely silent, big shoulders, careful eyes, had finished his coffee and was now turning his cup in slow circles on the table waiting for a refill. Ryan looked at these four men, these men who had in the space of less than an hour received them at gunpoint, talked them down, erased their debt, laid plans to dismantle the operation that had created the debt, fed them pie, and arranged for the most immediate crisis of their lives to be handled with a single 10-minute phone call. And he tried to find a framework that made sense of it, that organized it into something he could carry with him, some lesson or principle or story he could tell himself about what had happened tonight and why. He couldn't find one, not a clean one, not the kind you can package into a sentence. What he could find was this: the world was bigger than the trap he'd been living in. That was it. That was the whole thing. He'd been so deep inside the debt, inside the fear, inside the four walls of the apartment, in the tick of the clock toward Friday morning, that the world had shrunk down to the size of that problem, and he'd lost the ability to see past it. And tonight, in the least likely place, under the least likely circumstances, someone had shown him the edges of his own situation from the outside, and the situation was smaller than it had felt from inside. He was still in trouble. He still had no job, no savings, a damaged relationship with the woman he'd loved since he was 20, and a 4-year-old daughter in Victorville, who thought his best quality was looking like a purple cloud. The debt was gone, but the conditions that created the debt were not. That was real. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't real. But he was alive, and he was outside the trap, and Lily had made him a horse. Jake set his fork down on the empty plate. He looked at Ryan. "We should probably get goings," he said. "Yeah." Ryan didn't move immediately. He looked at Callahan one more time. "I don't know how to," he stopped. "There's nothing I can say that—" "You don't have to say anything," Callahan said. "I know, but I want to." Ryan looked at him directly. "Thank you for not doing what you could have done, for doing what you did instead." Callahan held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once short, the nod of a man who has received something and acknowledged it without making it larger than it needs to be. "Go see your daughter," he said. "First thing in the morning. Don't wait." Ryan nodded. He slid out of the booth. Jake was already standing. They stood there for a moment in the aisle between booth 8 and booth 9, two young men in black balaclavas that were now pulled up to their foreheads, standing in a roadside diner in the Mojave at 11. Something at night at the end of the worst plan and the most unexpected outcome of their lives. And Ryan felt the weight of it, all of it, everything that had happened in the last hour settle into him, the way things settle when they stop moving and start being real. He looked at the security camera above the counter, the small, unremarkable device that had been recording since before they walked through the door. The red light blinked once steadily, the way it always did. He looked away. "Good night, Brenda," Jake said. Behind the counter, Brenda was washing a cup with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the most appropriate response to the night's events is competent dishwashing. She didn't look up. "Drive safe," she said. They walked to the door. Ryan pushed it open. The bell above it made its small, cheerful sound again. The same sound it had made when they walked in, completely unchanged by everything that had happened in between, and the cold Mojave air hit them dry and real and enormous. Ryan stopped in the doorway. He turned back one last time and looked at the diner, at Brenda behind the counter, at the trucker on his stool finishing his second piece of pie, at the couple near the window still quiet, still close together, at the four men in booth 9 already returned to their conversation, already past the moment. in the way that people are past moments when moments are part of the texture of their lives rather than exceptions to it. At the camera above the counter blinking red, then he stepped out into the night and let the door close behind him. The drive back to Barstow took 43 minutes. Ryan knew this because he counted, not the miles, not the landmarks, he counted the minutes. The way you count things when your brain needs something simple and mechanical to hold on to, so it doesn't fall into the larger, more complicated territory underneath. 1 minute, 2 minutes, the headlights pushing against the dark. The highway empty and straight, the kind of straight that only exists in desert country where the road doesn't need to negotiate with anything. Jake didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes. Neither did Ryan. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That was the strange thing about it. After everything, the planning, the drive out, the diner, the guns on the table, the phone call, the pie, the walk back to the truck across that cracked parking lot with the orange lights blinking overhead. After all of it, the silence between them in the cab of the truck felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like they'd both been carrying something very loud for a very long time and had finally set it down somewhere, and the quiet in its absence was not empty, but full. Full of all the things that didn't need to be said because they'd both lived them. At the 22-minute mark, Jake said, "I'm sorry." Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "Jake, I need to say it." Jake's voice was different from how it had sounded in the diner. Not cracked anymore, not flat, not the robotic register of a man running on pure logic. Something realer. Something that had been underwater for a while and had come back up. "This was my idea, all of it. The loan in the first place, the plan Pioneer Wells. I talked you into every piece of it. And he stopped. "I almost got us killed, Ryan. I almost got us killed or arrested or both, and I almost made your daughter grow up without a father because I thought I could solve a math problem with a shotgun." Ryan was quiet for a moment. The road went. The desert went. "You were trying to help," he said. "That's not an excuse." "No, but it's true." Ryan glanced at him. "You were scared. I was scared. We made a bad decision together. I could have said no. I didn't say no. You almost said no in the parking lot." "Almost isn't no, Jake." Ryan looked back at the road. "I got in the truck. I drove there. I walked through that door. That's on me, too." Jake turned his head and looked out the passenger window. Outside was darkness and the occasional fence post catching the headlights for a half second before the truck passed and the darkness took it back. "What do you think happens to Velasquez?" he said. Ryan thought about it. "I think Callahan meant what he said." "Yeah." Jake paused. "I think so too." Another pause. Danny looked excited about it. "Danny looked like a man who has been waiting for a reason," Ryan agreed. Jake made a sound that was closer to a real laugh than anything that had come out of either of them in hours. Then it faded and the quiet came back and they drove. At the 38-minute mark, Ryan said, "I'm going to Victorville in the morning." Jake nodded, didn't look surprised. "You want company?" "No." Ryan said it without heat. "I need to go alone. There are things I need to say to Cassie that I can only say if it's just us. And Lily." He stopped, breathed. "I need Lily to just see me. Not me and you. Just me. Just her dad showing up." "Yeah," Jake said. "That's right. That's exactly right." The lights of Barstow appeared on the horizon, the particular smear of orange and white that a small city makes against the desert sky, visible from miles out in the flat country, like a fire someone left burning. Ryan felt his hands relax slightly on the wheel. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding it. "Jake," he said, "yeah, we're never doing anything like that again." "Ryan, I'm serious. I need you to—" "I know," Jake said. "I know. I swear to you. Never again." He paused. "I mean it this time in a way I wouldn't have meant it last week, if that makes sense. Like before tonight, I would have meant it because things worked out. Now I mean it because of what almost happened before things worked out." Ryan understood exactly what that meant. The distinction was real and it mattered, and it was the kind of thing you couldn't manufacture without having actually stood in a roadside diner pointing a shotgun at men who didn't flinch. They pulled into Barstow at 11:54. Ryan parked in front of the apartment building and turned off the engine, and they sat in the truck for a moment more, the engine ticking as it cooled the parking lot quiet around them. "Get some sleep," Ryan said. "You too." Jake opened the door, then stopped. He sat there with the door open and the cold air coming in and looked at Ryan with an expression that had all the things in it that cousins accumulate over 26 years of shared history, childhood and fights and laughter and bad decisions and worse decisions and the particular loyalty that doesn't require maintenance because it's structural load-bearing built into the foundation. I'm glad it was Callahan in that booth, he said. Ryan looked at him. Me too. Jake got out. Ryan watched him cross the parking lot and go through the building door. Then he sat alone in the truck for a few more minutes in the quiet with the ticking engine and the Barstow night around him, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time he'd been able to think about nothing in particular in months. Then he went inside and went to bed. He slept until 8:15, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep he'd had since August. And when he woke up, he lay on his back in the gray morning light for exactly 30 seconds before he got up, showered, changed into the cleanest clothes he owned, and got back in the truck. He drove to Victorville. He didn't call first. He thought about calling. He picked up the phone twice on the way and put it back down both times. The second time he put it down, he understood why he kept not calling, because calling gave Cassie the option to prepare to have a conversation in advance, to do the emotional work of the situation at a distance before he arrived. And what he needed, what he felt in his bones was necessary, was to show up, to be physically present, to let the fact of him standing at her door be the first sentence, because some things can only be said in person, and what he needed to say was one of them. Cassie answered the door in a gray sweatshirt with her hair pulled back and an expression that moved through 3 phases in about 2 seconds. Surprised and something cautious, then something that was working very hard at neutral. "Ryan," she said. "Hi." He stood there. He had thought on the drive over about what he was going to say first. He had prepared something. Standing at the door, he couldn't remember any of it. "I got your text," he said, "about the horse." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not the way faces shift in movies, but the small, real way that faces shift when a person is receiving information that changes the calculation they have been running. "You drove from Barstow," she said. "Yeah." "Ryan, she glanced at her phone. "It's 9:30 in the morning." "I know." She looked at him. At his face, specifically the way Cassie always looked at him when she was trying to determine whether he was telling her the truth, the particular quality of attention she had that made him feel every time like she could read him better than he could read himself. He had always both loved and been afraid of that quality. "Something happened," she said. "Yeah." "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I am." He meant it. He could tell, she could tell he meant it, and he could tell that surprised her because the last several times she'd asked him some version of that question, the answer had been a variation on a lie. "I need to tell you some things," he said. "Not all of it right now. I'll tell you all of it eventually, but right now I just need to tell you the important part." She stepped back from the door. She let him in. The house smelled like coffee and the particular domestic warmth of a morning that's been going for an hour. Already someone had made breakfast. There were sounds from the back of the house that Ryan recognized as the television in the living room, a cartoon at the volume that a 4-year-old considers appropriate. His chest did something complicated. "She's watching her show," Cassie said. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, not hostile, just careful. Protective in the way of someone who has been doing the protecting alone for a while and has gotten good at it. "What do you need to tell me?" Ryan sat down at the kitchen table. The same table they'd bought together at a garage sale when they were 22. The one with the wobbly leg that he'd fixed 3 times and that had always eventually come loose again. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at Cassie. "I almost did something very stupid last night," he said. "I'm not going to tell you everything right now because some of it is I need to work through how to say it. But I need you to know that I came close to making a decision that could have taken me away from Lily permanently. Not just distance, not just the situation we're already in." He held her gaze. "And I didn't do it. And it changed something for me, Cassie. It changed something in a way that I don't fully have language for yet, but it's real and it's not going away." Cassie was very still. "Ryan, I know I've said things before. I know my record of saying things and then not. I know what my record looks like. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm not standing here saying, trust me." He shook his head. "I'm just asking you to let me be here today, and then tomorrow, And then the day after that, let me show you what changed instead of trying to convince you it changed. The television in the living room was playing something with a lot of cheerful music. A cartoon horse, Ryan thought distractedly, and the thought landed with a small private weight. Cassie looked at him for a long time, long enough that he became aware of the refrigerator hum and the distant cartoon music and the particular morning light coming through the kitchen window and the wobble in the table leg when he shifted his weight. Long enough that he had time to understand she was doing serious work behind those eyes, running some calculation that mattered to her and to him and to the 4-year-old in the other room, and that he had no ability to influence the result of that calculation from the outside. He'd done his part. The decision was hers. Okay, she said finally. One word, small, real. Okay, he repeated. Today, she said. You can be here today. We'll see about tomorrow. She looked at him steadily. But Ryan, if something happened last night, something real, I'm going to need to know what it was eventually, not to hold it against you, because I need to understand what changed and why. I need to know it's real. It's real, he said. I believe you think it is, she said. I need to see it. That was fair. That was more than fair. That was Cassie being exactly who she was. Clear-eyed, not cruel, requiring proof, not out of punishment, but out of the earned knowledge that words without actions are just weather. Before either of them could say anything else, there was a sound from the hallway, small footsteps. The kind of footsteps that are in a hurry and not particularly coordinated about it. And then Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing pajamas with small yellow stars on them. Her hair was doing something ambitious and unresolved. She had a crayon in one hand, purple. Ryan noticed his heart doing something that had no medical name, and she was looking at Ryan with the specific expression of a 4-year-old encountering something that doesn't fit into their current understanding of the morning schedule. Daddy Rye, she said, Ryan's throat closed. He had thought on the drive from Barstow about this moment. He had thought about what he would say. He had prepared something for this too, and just like with Cassie, the preparation evaporated completely when the actual moment arrived, because the actual moment was so much more than anything preparation could have accounted for. She was right there. She was 4 years old and she had a purple crayon, and she was looking at him with those gray-green eyes that his mother always said came from her side of the family, and she was real and she was there. And 24 hours ago, he had been in an apartment in Barstow, agreeing to a plan that could have put a wall between him and this moment that no subsequent decision could ever have brought down. Hey, Bug, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Lily looked at him for another half-second. 4-year-olds process unexpected information at their own pace and in their own way, a way that adults have largely lost access to. And then she crossed the kitchen at the specific speed of a small child who has made up her mind about something, and she climbed into his lap with the total physical confidence of someone who has never once questioned whether that lap would be available to receive her, and she held up the purple crayon and said, I'm making you a horse. Ryan put his arms around her. He held her the way you hold something when you understand in your body, rather than your head, how close you came to not having it. Not tight, he was careful. She was small, but completely, with everything. I heard, he said against the top of her head. Mama told me. I drove here to see it. It's not done, Lily said with the pragmatic precision of someone who takes their artistic commitment seriously. That's okay, Ryan said. I'll wait. Cassie was leaning against the kitchen counter watching them, and she had her arms still folded, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she hadn't decided how to express yet, the slight tightening at the corners, the eyes that were working too hard at being neutral. She was going to cry in approximately 30 seconds, Ryan thought. He was going to beat her to it by about 20. He breathed, he held his daughter. The kitchen was warm and it smelled like coffee, and the cartoon in the other room had moved on to something with a lot of singing. 40 miles away in a roadside diner on Route 58, the security camera above the counter continued its steady work, its red light blinking with the patient consistency of something that doesn't know what it records, only that it records everything. Brenda Kowalski was starting her morning shift, coming in to find the night's dishes done and the floor mopped and the coffee maker freshly loaded, the work of the overnight cook, who had said nothing to nobody and had simply done his job and gone home the way he did every night. The diner smelled like it always smelled. The booths looked like they always looked. Booth 9 in the back by the hallway had been wiped clean, the table surface bare and unremarkable, the carved K in the corner of the table still there, the way it always was unchanged. 8 motorcycles were gone from the side lot, had been gone since before midnight. Brenda made herself a cup of coffee, the first pot of the day, the good one, the one she allowed herself before the customers arrived, and she stood behind the counter and she looked at the camera above it for a moment. Then she looked away. The first trucker of the morning came in at 6:52 and sat at the counter and ordered eggs and black coffee, and Brenda brought them without fanfare. And the morning started the way mornings always started at Pioneer Wells, which was without drama or announcement. One thing following another, the ordinary machinery of a day beginning again. But in an apartment on the south side of Barstow, Jake Harris was awake earlier than he'd been awake in months, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and his phone looking at the number for a job placement service he'd found online at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. He'd looked at it for a while, then he'd closed his phone, then he'd opened it again. He was still looking at it now. At 8:47, he called. The phone rang 3 times. A woman answered. Jake said, "Hi, I'm looking for work. I don't have a lot of experience in any one thing, but I work hard and I'm reliable and I'm trying to get things going in a better direction." He stopped. He hadn't meant to say all of that. It had come out because it was true and because the events of the previous night had apparently removed whatever filter usually stood between what he meant and what he said. "Sorry, I can start right away." The woman on the other end of the phone said, "That's all right, hun. Let me ask you a few questions." Jake exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." Meanwhile, 63 miles from Barstow, in a part of the desert that didn't have a commonly used name, a phone was ringing in a tire shop that was not yet open for business. The phone rang 7 times, then a voice answered, thick, careful, the voice of a man who had been awake for some time already and was choosing his words with the specific deliberateness of someone who has recently received news that required recalibration. "Yeah," said the voice. The man on the other end of the line said 4 words. "We need to talk." A long silence. "I know," said Toad Velasquez. And for the first time in 3 years of running his operation along the 58 corridor, his voice had something in it that had never been there before. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to it. The specific quality of a man who has spent a long time believing he operated outside the notice of anything larger than himself, and who has just received the first clear signal that he was wrong. "When?" said the voice on the phone. "I can be there in an hour," Velasquez said. "Make it 45 minutes. The line went dead. Velasquez sat in the chair in his office at the back of the tire shop in the dark with the dead phone in his hand. He sat there for a moment that stretched in a way that moments stretch when a person is feeling the specific gravity of consequence, not the consequence of last night, not just Ryan Miller and Jake Harris and Pioneer Wells, but the longer consequence, the accumulated weight of 3 years of operating a certain way in a certain territory with a certain assumption about who was paying attention and who was not. He had been wrong about who was paying attention. He set the phone down. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a ledger. Actual paper. Actual ink. The old-fashioned kind, the kind that exists because people who operate the way Toad Velasquez operated don't put things in computers. He opened it. 41 names. 41 accounts, each with a balance, each with a payment history, each with notes in a small, tight handwriting about the specific circumstances that made each person cooperative. He looked at the list for a long time. Then, for reasons he could not have fully explained and would not have admitted to anyone, he took a pen from the desk and he drew a single line through the first name on the list. Ryan Miller, balance $4,200. He looked at the line through the name. He turned the pen in his fingers, then he set it down. He still had 40 names, he still had a business, he still had enforcement in territory, and 3 years of accumulated leverage. One phone call from one man in one diner didn't change the arithmetic of that. He knew it didn't. He'd been in difficult conversations before, and he'd come out of all of them because he was careful, and because he understood risk, and because the people who came at him always eventually found that the cost wasn't worth it. He told himself all of this sitting in the dark office at the back of the tire shop with the ledger open in front of him and the line through Ryan Miller's name. He believed approximately half of it. The other half, the part he couldn't argue away. The part that had settled into him the moment he heard Callahan's voice on the phone last night and understood who was calling and from where and what it meant, that the man was calling personally, that half sat in him like a stone, cold and specific, the weight of something that wasn't going anywhere. He closed the ledger. He got up and got his keys. 45 minutes, the voice had said. Toad Velasquez was not whatever else could be said about him, a man who was late to important meetings. Toad Velasquez arrived at the meeting 43 minutes after the phone call, 2 minutes early, because whatever else he was not a man who gave anyone the advantage of waiting on him. The location was a truck stop diner 12 miles east of Barstow off a secondary road that most GPS systems didn't bother naming, not Pioneer Wells. Neutral ground, the voice on the phone had specified, and Velasquez had understood what that meant. Not your territory, not ours, somewhere in between, somewhere that belonged to the road itself and to nobody in particular. He'd been to this diner once before years ago for a different kind of meeting, and it had ended the way most of his meetings ended, with the other person understanding something they hadn't understood when they walked in. He was less certain how this one would end. He pushed through the door. The morning crowd was thin, 2 tables occupied, a waitress moving between them, a cook visible through the pass-through. Velasquez scanned the room with the automatic efficiency of a man who has spent 20 years in situations where exits and occupants are information you collect immediately upon entry. Danny was sitting at a corner table. Just Danny. No one else visible. Which meant Velasquez understood immediately that there were at least 2 other people in this building that he hadn't seen yet, positioned in ways he wasn't meant to find immediately. He knew how this worked. He'd used the same geometry himself often enough. He crossed the room and sat down across from Danny without being invited to, because sitting down without being invited was its own statement, and the one thing Toad Velasquez could not afford in this meeting was to appear as if he needed permission for anything. Danny looked at him. Danny had the specific quality of stillness that Velasquez associated with men who had been in a great many rooms with a great many difficult people and had come out of all of them, which meant the stillness wasn't performed. It was the accumulated residue of never having needed to be nervous, of having tested the proposition enough times that it had become settled fact. Toad, Danny said. You said 45 minutes, Velasquez said. I'm early. I noticed. Danny poured coffee from the pot on the table he'd already ordered, already made himself comfortable. Another statement, another piece of the geometry. He poured a second cup and pushed it toward Velasquez. Callahan sends his regards. Callahan could have come himself. Callahan did what he needed to do last night. This morning is a different kind of conversation. Danny wrapped both hands around his own cup. You drew a line through Miller's name. Velasquez went very still. He didn't let it show. He'd spent 20 years learning not to let things show, and the training was deep enough that even a statement like that, a statement that meant someone had been inside his office, inside his desk, inside his ledger, between midnight and 7 in the morning, landed without visible effect. But inside, something cold moved through him, something that had nothing to do with the morning air. You went into my shop, he said. We needed to understand the scope of the situation, Danny said. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't aggressive. He was simply explaining something the way you explain something to someone who needs the information to make a decision. 41 names. We have the list. The cold thing inside Velasquez moved again. That list it's a record of every family you've got on the hook between Barstow and Needles, Danny said. Boss, we know, we counted. We've been making calls since 6 this morning. Velasquez stopped. He set his coffee cup down carefully. Those are my accounts. They were your accounts, Danny said. Past tense is doing some work in that sentence. Velasquez looked at him across the table. He was running calculations, had been running them since the phone rang at 6 in the morning, since he'd sat in his dark office with the ledger open, since he'd driven 12 miles on a secondary road to sit across from a man who had been inside his office without his permission, and was now casually informing him that everything he'd built over 3 years was being disassembled while they sat here drinking coffee that he hadn't ordered. You can't just erase debt, Velasquez said. His voice was controlled, professionally controlled. These people borrowed money, real money, money that came from somewhere. You can't just call 40 families and tell them the debt is gone. That's not how. We didn't tell them the debt is gone, Danny said. We told them the enforcement is gone. There's a difference. He looked at Velasquez steadily. The money you lent, some of it's real the way you said. Some of it stopped being real the first time you compounded an interest rate that no judge in California would recognize as legal. We're not interested in the accounting argument. We're interested in the enforcement. A pause. Specifically, we're interested in making sure that the men you use for enforcement understand that coming into this territory to collect from families is no longer a viable career path. Velasquez said nothing. 2 of them got that message last night, Danny continued. The other 3 got it this morning, in person, with enough specificity that I'm confident they understood. Something shifted in Velasquez's chest. Not fear, he reframed it immediately the way he always reframed things, turning it over until it resembled something more manageable. Information. This was information. A new set of parameters. A changed landscape. He could work with changed landscapes. He had done it before. So what do you want, he said. If this is a negotiation, tell me the number. If you want me to pay something to get my operation back. It's not a negotiation, Danny said. Silence. Then what is it? It's a conversation where I explain to you what your options are. Danny said, so you can make an informed decision about what comes next. He set his cup down. Option 1, you continue trying to operate the way you've been operating. You find new enforcement, you rebuild the accounts, you run the same model you've been running. This is an option available to you. It will result in an ongoing and escalating level of attention from people who have significantly more patience and resources than you do, and who have nothing to lose by applying that attention indefinitely. He paused to let that settle. Option 2, you take the tire shop and the money you've made over 3 years and you go somewhere else. Not this territory, not the 58 corridor, not Barstow, not Victorville, not anything from here to Needles. You go somewhere that isn't ours and you become someone else's problem. Another pause. Those are the options. Velasquez looked at him. That's not a choice. That's an ultimatum. I called it options out of politeness, Danny agreed. You can call it an ultimatum if that's more accurate. The waitress appeared at the edge of the table. She looked at Velasquez, then at Danny with the careful neutrality of a woman who has read the room and made a professional decision to be as invisible as possible. Can I get you anything? She asked Velasquez. No, he said. He didn't look at her. She left. Velasquez put both hands flat on the table. He looked at Danny the way he looked at people when he was deciding something, not hostile, not performing, just looking the way a man looks, when he's running a real calculation and needs to see the other person clearly in order to do it accurately. Miller and his cousin, he said. What happened at Pioneer Wells last night? What about it? They walked in with guns. They pointed them at Callahan. Velasquez tilted his head, and Callahan let them walk out. He did. Why? Danny was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, Velasquez could tell. He had an answer immediately. The pause was something else, the pause of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. Because they put the guns down when he asked, Danny said finally, because they were scared people in a trap, not criminals who'd chosen a life. And because Callahan has been doing this long enough to know the difference between those two things, even when the person in front of him can't see it themselves. Velasquez absorbed this. He turned it over. He examined it the way he examined everything, looking for the angle, looking for what it was worth, looking for how it could be used. And for the first time in a very long time, he encountered something he couldn't find an angle on. Because there was no angle. It was just true. It was just a man who had the power to destroy 2 people and chose not to because the right call was not to. Velasquez had not made many decisions in his life on the basis of what the right call was. He made decisions on the basis of what was profitable and what was protected and what advanced the position. The concept of the right call as a primary consideration was not something he had spent much time with. Sitting across from Danny in a truck, stopped diner on a secondary road 12 miles east of Barstow, he felt the absence of that consideration for the first time as something other than a neutral fact. I'll need 2 weeks, he said. Danny looked at him. To settle what's actually owed, the real amounts, not the compounded ones, and to close the accounts properly. 2 weeks. Velasquez kept his voice even. Then I'm gone. Danny studied him for a moment with the focused attention of a man who is very good at reading whether someone means what they're saying. Whatever he found in Velasquez's face satisfied him enough. He picked up his coffee cup. 2 weeks, he said. Danny will check in on day 8. If the process looks right, you get the full 2 weeks. If it doesn't, it'll look right, Velasquez said. He stood up. He'd spent 20 years leaving rooms in a particular way, slowly, deliberately, in control of the pace and direction of his exit. He stood up the same way now. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Danny one last time. "The kid," he said. "Miller, he's got a daughter." "He does," Danny said. Velasquez nodded. Something moved across his face that was too brief and too complicated to name. "Good," he said, and then he walked out. Danny watched the door close. He sat with his coffee for a moment. Then he took out his phone and typed a single word to Callahan. "Done." The reply came back in 30 seconds. One word. "Good." Danny put the phone in his pocket and finished his coffee. 3 weeks later, Ryan Miller started a job. It wasn't remarkable work. Warehouse receiving, 40 hours a week, $15.50 an hour, out in San Bernardino. He'd applied on a Tuesday, interviewed on Thursday, started the following Monday. He wore steel-toed boots that he bought at a surplus store and drove 40 minutes each way on the 15 and in the mornings before the sun came up fully with the highway still relatively clear and the radio playing something low. He felt something he hadn't felt in close to a year. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Happiness was further down the road, something he could see from where he was but hadn't reached. What he felt was solidity, the specific, unremarkable solidity of a person who knows what they're doing that day and why, who has a place to be and a reason to be there. He called Cassie on his lunch break every day. Not always for long, sometimes just 10 minutes, sometimes less. But every day, she answered every time. They were talking in a way they hadn't talked in a long time, not the careful, managed conversations of two people negotiating a failed situation, but real talking, the kind that goes to actual places. It was not fixed. He knew it wasn't fixed. But it was moving and moving in a direction that felt like forward, rather than the long, horizontal slide of the previous year. He saw Lily on weekends when he could arrange it, 3 times in the first month. The horse drawing, which was as advertised ambitious in its relationship to literal equine anatomy, but extraordinary in its commitment to the color purple, was taped to the wall above his bed in the apartment in Barstow. He'd told Lily it was the best horse he'd ever seen, and she'd looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said with complete seriousness, "It's actually a flying horse, Daddy Rye. See the wings?" He had looked more carefully. He had, in fact, been unable to identify the wings. He had told her they were beautiful anyway. She had accepted sis. Jake got the job through the placement service. Construction crew out of Hesperia physical work early mornings. He'd come home the first week sore in muscles he hadn't known he had, and slept 12 hours and gone back the next morning. By the 3rd week, he'd stopped being sore. By the end of the month, he was the one explaining things to the new people. He didn't talk much about Pioneer Wells, neither did Ryan. Not with each other, not with anyone else. It was not a secret exactly, it was more like a thing that had happened in another version of their lives, a version that felt increasingly far away. The way places feel far away after you've left them for long enough. But it did not fade the way ordinary memories fade. It stayed specific, stayed detailed. The sound of the bell above the diner door, the red light blinking on the camera above the counter, the weight of the shotgun going down to his side without him deciding to lower it. The sound of Callahan's voice saying 4 words that had rearranged something in Ryan at the molecular level. "Put the gun down. You don't want this." Ryan thought about those words on the drive to San Bernardino in the morning sometimes. He thought about the version of that night that could have happened, that should have happened statistically, given the choices they'd made, walking in, and he let himself think about it long enough to remember what it cost, and then he let it go. Because holding it too long wasn't useful, and he had places to be. On a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after the night at Pioneer Wells, Brenda Kowalski arrived at work to find a manila envelope on the counter. No name on it, no return address, just the envelope sitting between the coffee maker and the pie case in a spot that would have required someone to come through a door that was locked from the outside. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. The handwriting was small and tight and entirely legible for the register, for the trouble. C, under the note, was $2,500 in cash. Brenda stood behind the counter for a moment with the envelope in her hands. Then she put the money in the register and threw the envelope away and made herself a cup of coffee and said nothing about it to anyone ever, which was consistent with the approach she'd taken to the entire evening in question. She did, however, that morning, take the security camera footage off the 24-hour loop and copy it to a personal drive that she kept in her locker. She didn't know why she did this. She told herself she didn't know why. She put the drive in her locker and locked it and went back to work, and that was that. She would look at the footage exactly once 6 months later, late on a night when the diner was empty and she was closing up. She would watch the whole thing, the door opening, the bell, the guns going up, the moment when the room changed, the conversation in the booths, the pie, the phone call, the guns going down on the table, the two young men walking out. She would watch it the way you watch something that you need to see one more time in order to believe it was real. Then she would lock the drive back in her locker and never watch it again. The footage never went anywhere. It was never posted, never shared, never uploaded to anything. The camera above the counter ran on its 24-hour loop and overwrote the night exactly as Callahan had said it would. There was no viral video. There was no millions of views. There was no story that spread across the internet in the way that stories spread when someone decides to make them spread. There was only what actually happened, which was this: two desperate young men walked into a roadside diner with guns and walked out without firing them because a man in a booth in the back decided that the right response to being threatened was not what everyone would have expected it to be, and because two people who were in the wrong made the one right choice available to them when it was offered, and because sometimes, not usually, but sometimes that is enough. On a Sunday afternoon in October, Ryan Miller drove to Victorville with a used bicycle in the bed of his truck. Purple because Lily had mentioned 3 separate times that her favorite color was purple, in case he'd forgotten, which he hadn't. He'd found it at a garage sale in Barstow for $30, and he'd spent Saturday evening in the parking lot of the apartment building, cleaning it up and adjusting the seat height and oiling the chain until it looked, if not new, then at least like something that had been cared about. Lily saw it through the window before he was even out of the truck. He heard the sound she made from inside a sound that did not resolve into words, because 4-year-olds at the peak of excitement sometimes exceed the vocabulary available to them and express themselves through volume alone. And by the time he had the bike out of the truck bed and was walking it up the driveway, she was already through the front door and across the porch and down the steps with her arms out and her hair doing its usual ambitious and unresolved thing. She didn't run to the bike. She ran to him. She ran to him first, and he caught her, and she grabbed his neck with both arms the way she always did, the way she'd done since she was old enough to run, with the complete physical trust of someone who has never once had to wonder whether the arms would be there. And Ryan held her up with one arm and held the bike steady with the other hand and stood in the driveway of his daughter's grandmother's house in Victorville on a Sunday afternoon in October and understood in a way that was beyond language and beyond thought what he had almost thrown away. "Is it for me?" Lily asked. She was looking at the bike now, still in his arms, leaning toward it. "It's for you," he said. "It's purple." "I know. I love it," she said with the simple, total conviction that only children have access to, the conviction that comes from not yet having learned to qualify. Then she wriggled out of his arms and went to it, and he set her down, and she put both hands on the handlebars and looked at it with an expression of profound ownership. Cassie appeared in the doorway. She looked at the bike, then at Ryan. She had her coffee cup in both hands, and she was wearing the gray sweatshirt again, and she looked like someone who had decided at some point in the last several weeks to stop bracing for something and to simply see what happened. "She's going to want to ride it immediately," Cassie said. "I know," Ryan said. "You're going to have to run alongside her." "I know. You're wearing the wrong shoes for that." Ryan looked down at his shoes. She was right. He looked up at Cassie. She was smiling a small smile, the kind she kept close and the kind she'd always been careful with, but real. The most real thing he'd seen in a long time. "I'll manage," he said. Cassie nodded. She looked at Lily, who was now attempting to get on the bike without assistance and with significant optimism about her current ability to balance. Then she looked at Ryan one more time. Something passed between them that wasn't ready to be named yet. Something still finding its shape, still too new and too fragile for the full weight of language. But it was there. It was real. It was the beginning of something that had the right materials to become solid if they were both careful with it. "Come inside when she's tired," Cassie said. Ryan nodded. She went back inside. Ryan turned to his daughter, who had gotten one foot on a pedal and was wobbling with full commitment and zero fear, and he walked over and put his hands on the back of the seat, and Lily said, "Don't let go, Daddy, Rye." And he said, "I won't." And they started moving down the driveway together. the bike finding its unsteady rhythm, Lily laughing at the speed of it, Ryan running alongside her in the wrong shoes on a Sunday afternoon in October, with his heart so full it was almost unbearable. He didn't let go. 40 miles away in Barstow, a tire shop on the south side of town sat locked and dark, a closed sign in the window, the lot empty, no cars, no appointment board visible through the glass. A neighbor 3 doors down said the man who ran it had left about 2 weeks ago. Moved, he thought. Somewhere east he'd heard, though he didn't know for certain and hadn't asked. The shop had been quiet since then. No activity, just the building sitting there looking like what it was, a place where something used to happen that didn't happen anymore. In a coffee shop in San Bernardino, Michael Callahan sat at a corner table and drank his coffee and read the news on his phone with the unhurried quality of a man who has nowhere he needs to be and no one he needs to answer to this morning. His phone buzzed once. He looked at the screen. A text from Danny Tire Shop's been dark for 11 days. Looks clean. Callahan typed back, good. Then he put the phone in his pocket and finished his coffee. He did not think about Ryan Miller particularly often. He thought about him the way you think about things that resolve correctly briefly when something else calls the image forward and then let go. He had done what he did because it was right and because it was in front of him and because the alternative, doing nothing, letting the situation resolve the way it would have resolved without intervention, was not something he could sit with. That was all. He didn't require it to be more than that. He didn't know about the bicycle. He didn't know about Lily running to her father in the driveway instead of running to the bike. He didn't know about Cassie's smile in the doorway, or Jake starting work in Hesperia, or Brenda watching the footage alone on a quiet night and then locking it away. He didn't know about any of the after because the after was not his to know. He'd done the part that was his. The rest belonged to the people who lived it. The security camera above the counter at Pioneer Wells blinked its steady red blink. The diner stayed open. The coffee stayed on the warmer. Truckers came and went, families on their way to and from Las Vegas, locals who needed something familiar at the end of a long day. Booth 9 sat at the back by the hallway, the carved K in its corner unchanged. On some nights it was empty. On some nights it was occupied by 4 men eating quietly and talking low the way they always did, the way they'd been doing for years. Nobody who came in on those nights would have known that anything had happened there. Nothing looked different. Nothing was marked. The diner was just a diner doing what it had always done, being what it had always been, a place people came to when they needed to stop to eat something warm, to exist for a little while in a space that was lit against the dark. The Mojave doesn't remember things. The desert doesn't hold stories. It just goes on flat and enormous and indifferent, the same after as before, unchanged by everything that happens inside the small lit rooms scattered across it. But some nights change the people in them, and the people carry what the desert won't. That is enough. That has always been enough.